coming to, this must be the fourth, I think, of these readings, this reading series, maybe even the fifth. Just a couple notes. I'm going to turn the chat session off during the reading period, but on the chat session, there are links to both the anthology online and a pre-order to get the physical version. So if you want to get those, you could look at the chat room now and copy that. Other things, sometimes the mute on arrival works, sometimes it doesn't. So if everybody could just check and make sure that you're muted, unless of course you're the person reading, make sure then that you're unmuted. And after the reading's over, I'll open up the chat room to everybody, so you can either make a comment to everyone or just to an individual. And then we tend to have a discussion. And we encourage you to stay around, join us for that discussion. And I'm now going to turn it over to Mary Newell, who's going to give our introduction. Thanks, Mary.
Greetings. In case you haven't been to previous events of this series, welcome to the Poetics for the More Than Human World anthology series. Thanks to all the participants, all the readers, all of you who are here listening, looking, and to Swensen, who organized the reading series. The Poetics for the More Than Human World started as a web journal issue and developed into a full-fledged anthology, and it will become a print anthology in September. Fingers crossed, sometime in the early fall. The editors are Bernard Quetchenbach, who's on your screen, myself, Mary Newell, and Sarah Nolan. For the anthology, we looked for writing that exceeded an egocentric and preferably an anthropocentric viewpoint. We welcomed innovative strategies and hoped for writing that approached ecological challenges on various scales, with an aim to either correspond to or evoke a view of interconnectedness among different species. And we were very happy to have a variety of approaches to this very large undertaking, as I think you'll hear today. The anthology will be published in the fall. It's available for pre-order. And meanwhile, today, let's enjoy this opportunity to share together and hear how these 7 poets find language to express dilemmas and hopes for conscientious living during these difficult times. Our first reader is Catherine Greenwood.
Hello. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Cole. And I'm saying hello from Sheffield, so it's starting to get dark outside. I'm going to read an excerpt from my anthology poem, sort of the Reader's Digest version, because it's quite long. And then I'll finish with a couple of shorter poems from something I'm currently working on. I'm just going to try and bring up some images here on a PowerPoint. Share. Oh, okay. There we go. Can you see that? It's my... Not sure what's happening there.
There you go.
They're great. So I should have warned everybody, the first image is quite ghastly. This is where the idea for the Growler Bear's Ballad came from. I saw this story in 2006 about a bear that had been shot in the Arctic that was half polar bear, half grizzly. So, in his voice, first generation hybrid ursid, as a mutt of mud and snow. Ma were old polar stock and pa pure grizzly. Other way round, we'd be pizzly. Some prefer Nanuluck. Mother migrated south on a shrinking floe and swum the salt chuck's final lap to land. Father, fishing salmon on the archipelago, smelled her coming and pursued her rank musk upriver. 8 moons later, I were born a twin. I remembrance the milky pang of my sister and our den in a dim bank of snow, the warmth of our mother, a smothering heat of seal fat fueling the furnace in her belly. She'd trod north to rear us in old country ways, mackerel shanties like gannet and guts, how to knock wind from a walrus, how to read moonlight on fox face and feather, how to swim. I sank. Hairless toe pads cracked on hunts. Scoop snout and poop eyes, the uncles called us. Sister Mudfoot and me never fit in. A full 4 paws count of seasons till I struck out on the land to track our birthright's mystery. So after he stays with his dad's side of the family for a while, our bear sets out again. Snout scarred, maw full of roots, I roamed Salal reaches awful, alone, meatless on mountaintop, a dead metal bird with bones in its belly, paw slicing panes of ice on men's dwellings. A wolf gave warning, all kith killed by a hail of sharp stones. Humans make of us monsters, he snarled, and sunk off, society starved. I stole strips of chum strung on stone beaches, dried up tongues that tasted of salt and sleep. Nowhere we're home. And we know how the story ends, thanks to the newspaper picture I shared. And I'm just going to read a couple of poems from sort of an eco-Gothic sequence I'm working on called Siberian Spring. As you are probably aware, the Siberian permafrost is melting, and it's resulted in the remains of long extinct creatures being found, such as woolly mammoths, rhinos, little horses, and here's a picture of a bison. They've resulted in a black market for mammoth tusks. And there's some environmental degradation of the rivers where people are digging out these tusks. So two short poems from that. Mammoth Graveyard. Relics from a reckless dig, their luckless bones are wreckage. Hasty slag heaps piled in the minefields of churned muck. Rarer, skeletons entire, wrapped in the warm, woolly rugs of themselves. Memories as long as their tusks are stored in the blasted strata of the mud face. Corrupted, irretrievable data. Did they mourn their dead as elephants do? And last one. Stories. Huntsmen and elders say mammoths still walk the earth, have witnessed the immense shadows moving like slow, shaggy storm clouds across the horizon, tree stump feet shaking the taiga. Like the blade hoisted by the hero from its hiding place, or the hag-ridden hut that stalks the wood on living stilts. The creatures raised by their tellers shake off the glacial ice melting on matted pelts and live as legends live, spellborn, as clouds are carriers of rain. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Our next reader is Mark DuCharme.
Myself, okay. Thanks. Can you hear me all right? Can everyone hear me? Is that a yes? I can't see the screen. So, okay. Many thanks, first of all, to Mary, Bernard, and Sarah for putting this anthology together, and for Cole for organizing this series, and Charles for his effort in recording it. The first poem I'm going to read is from the anthology, and it's an elegy for the wonderful poet Jack Collum. It's titled ECOPOETIcs. Less ego, no cynicism. Be kind to starlings and finches and itinerant redbreasts and warblers who flower the air and ear. Do not err in simplicity, but embrace the wild panoply, the range of seeing and living and dying, yes. Don't mourn, but revel in summer's lushness. Be a song pollinator in the mad rush of waking. Attend to the pinnate, the mossy, the rooted, the alluvial and riverine conditions of this messy life which abounds by creek banks and runnels, by hilltops and rivulets, by the murmurs of weather and its polyglot botany, its grace of empurpled ripeness, rife with bounty, with ringing and singing in afternoon light. Attend to our mammalian neighbors, herbivorous or predatory, who mewl or bark, growl or cry, round our environs, under the sky, amid the extremes and slices gone by, in all weather, and this turning about and going, in this going on despite life, being more meager, even with sparrows rushing, now that you, dear human, are no longer here. And I'm going to read one more poem. It's a new poem. It's a little bit longer. It's a Sistina. The title is The Portent. The climate factory nudged newly imported drizzle while we were still at sea. Will you eat the drizzle this one time when the stars aren't far from your feet and the sea and all you expected to be near? Or is it too hard to be near? Had you left too early and were you far? The banjo nudged the peripheries with hostile feet, a unique sense of vividness that only drizzle could inspire. And you stood there for a time in muddled approbation, hoping for a furtive glimpse of the sea that never arrived, though it was your fate to dream again of the sea, of drowning in a way that reminded you of being near to parades and all their pomp and clutter, in the time the red earth stood still. Who nudged you then from your slumber, waiting for the drizzle to resume like a minor piano concerto, while gauds were strewn about the feet of the blond man playing the concerto, when the audience leapt to its feet and ran for the door? It will linger in the memory like a fateful sea voyage, like a lover's cryptic note, full of self-reproach, while drizzle itself alters the tune and its resonances. Are we near the end of the voyage, or must we be nudged from our torpor by the concerto, which sounds like amplified drizzle? Like the time the blonde man came to your cabin to inquire the time and whether you'd been having any bad dreams. He had blisters on his feet, he said, and advised you to take up golfing. On the greens, you can go looking for new endwords and secretly nudged balls, ever closer to the mark and to the margin of the sea, dividing you and us from the rest of natural life. When we are near it, we are not fearful of the drizzle and all that it portends, for we grew up not knowing differently that drizzle is a sign of danger and of time's rapid dispersion. If you were near, perhaps we could divide our breath and count with our feet, or with very old conch shells, themselves portentous, which remind us of the sea by which we stood for a time in supplicating grief, wondering whether fate could really be nudged at all. But who is ever really nudged? Come forth in the drizzle, wearing garments the color of the sea, and looking for the time ruined feet shall wander clayey earth in danger, drawing ever near. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Our next reader is Sally Bliumis-Dunn.
Hi, can you hear me? Nods, can you hear me? Yeah? So I'm really grateful to be part of this anthology. It's ECOPOETICS are very dear to my heart. And the poem that Mary chose is from my third book, Echolocation. It's the title poem, so I'll start by reading it to you. Echolocation. The whales can't hear each other calling in the noise-cluttered sea. They beach themselves. I saw one once heaved onto the sand with kelp stuck to its blue-gray skin. Heavy and immobile, it lay like a great sadness, and it was hard to breathe with all this stink. Its elliptical black eyes had stilled, were mostly dry, and barnacles clustered on its back like tiny brown volcanoes. Imagining the other whales, their roving weight, their blue-black webbing of the deep, I stopped knowing how to measure my own grief. And this one, large and dead on the sand, with its unimaginable 500-pound heart. So I'm going to read a couple more poems from this book. All my poems are pretty short. And I'll just say that looking at nature closely or trying to create an intimacy with the natural world for me that's really important, whether the poem succeeds or not. Anyway, this one's called Startled. Startled. Massive and black, the frigate birds on brambles in the distance. Their bright red guller sacks, full as spinnaker sails, billow from their feathers like giant hearts of skin and air. They remind us of our own hearts, oversized and awkward, quivering in lightest wind. And the last one from this book is called Quahog, and for those of you who don't know it, it's kind of clam. Quahog. Along the shore, like white eyelids, bleached, dead clams. I see one that is alive. I stop and watch it open. The two locked lids of its dull shell let emerge a delicate foot, like a white peony petal, that lifts the grains of sand, burying itself until what is left is a pucker on the tidal flats, pulsing. The sand is freckled with many such holes, and I feel let in on a secret, as when I caught the scraps of your voice, and I knocked, and you showed me the letter from your father who left when you were 5, and you told me that you read it, sometimes aloud. It's white rectangle, a door you keep open like a clam's thin siphon. So I'll read a couple more short ones. I had the feeling in January that, I don't know, it was just a feeling that nature was losing patience with us and trying to communicate with us. And I attributed it to global warming. I don't know if it had anything to do with the pandemic, but so 2 of these 3 poems are called Lingua Naturae, which is simply nature speaking. Lingua Naturae. When the water from the ocean wave stops reaching towards the shore and is not yet moving back to the sea, a small stillness like a door glistens on the wet sand, then disappears. A wooden door with green slats, a brass knob that won't turn. I keep sensing these signs as though nature were finally forcing itself to speak to us through the familiar. The coconut palms, as I walk beneath them, wind whip through their fronds, like someone rummaging frantically through a cluttered drawer. The hibiscus blossoms in red alarm, bells for forests burning. Lingua naturae. This is just around the start of spring. This is a later one. The green promise of new leaves opened like a jewelry box this morning. The one I remember from my mother's dresser. It was leather and gray as the leafless branches of last week's trees. I can still hear the brass hinges click open, and from the larger box of our family house, still hear my father's voice, his anger that seems endless and without mercy, like the sky. Last chance, he warns, in a kind of shadow chorus with these trees. Last chance. And I think back to those bare branches of last week, so late to bloom, and how for a moment I feared they never would. I think I've come to my 7 minutes, so I'll stop. Thanks. Thanks for listening. I can't wait to hear everybody else.
Thank you, Sally. Our next reader, one of our editors, is Bernard Quetchenbach.
Hello. Can you hear me? Can anybody hear me? Yes? Okay, good. Let me go to this. Okay. So I first off, I wanted to extend some acknowledgements. I want to thank Cole again on behalf of the editors for organizing this wonderful reading series. And I also want to thank Linda Russo, who has been so much help to us in so many different ways in this whole project. So thank you, Linda, also. I should say before I start that I tend to write very short poems and very long essays, which is not good career advice, I suppose, but here I am. So acknowledging the indigenous people in the Yellowstone Valley where I live is complicated. The history of human habitation goes back 10,000 years to Clovis time at least, and a travel corridor makes for a lot of complicated human connections. But I will acknowledge the Apsalica or Crow people who were, this area was central. It is central to their experience. And I'm going to start with a poem which is an especially set in a place that's especially important to the Crow people. The Pryor Mountains. The Pryor Mountains are south of where I live, and they're not a very, they're a small mountain range. They're not particularly high. They're certainly not extensive. They're surrounded by higher mountains, but they have unique ecology, unique history. And if you want to find out more about that, you can go to pryormountains.org. So this is called Early Snow, Bear Canyon. Limestone dreams, gray cottonwoods, another flood. For now, a thin juniper blue, a few dry flakes gone from your hand. I grew up in Rochester, New York on Lake Ontario. I want to read a Lake Ontario poem. And the Great Lakes, of course, a very rich environment, but also a very compromised environment. These next two poems have to do with Great Lakes water, among other things. This one is called Owl's Winter, the owl being a snowy owl. South, south from the high hummock, the lemming run, south to harbor mallards, drifts of lanky mergansers, crystalled bridges crusted with mussels, ice-slat concrete slabs, spray sharp as a gull's stare. And all that Great Lakes water ends up in the estuary of the St. Lawrence, which is one of the world's great estuaries, and all that toxicity does as well. There's an endangered population of beluga whales that lives all year in the St. Lawrence. So that's a little background. This is called Bas Saint-Laurent, which is in Quebec, the lower St. Lawrence, where it becomes the estuary. Estuary, tangle of syllables, dusted with tusks of sea urchin, fragments of blue mussel. Salt haze edges into stone. At dusk, low tide loses the granite boats of harbor seals. Talking back and forth, ring-billed gulls take easy krill from rack pools. Cliffs shadow the harbor. River feeds the whales. So last summer, I had the privilege of teaching a class in the Peruvian Amazon with Juan Carlos Galeano. And last week we talked a little bit about bewilderment. That was a really profoundly bewildering experience in many ways. I had students with me who were from Montana, many of whom had never been out of the United States before. They were under the impression that they could speak Spanish until they tried to do it with actual people who speak Spanish. And then Juan Carlos, who is in his natural environment, right? And I've known him for years in other contexts, and here he is in his most natural kind of place. So these are all just kind of direct observations taken from, we spent a lot of time on boats. And so there was plenty of time to look around and to write, and these are all 3-line little poems. There's only 6, well, I'm gonna read 6 of them. There are more, but it's called Amazon Reflections. From Cloudlight, a small boatload of bananas. Old growth logs lashed to a barge, leaving the forest. Low riding canoes, eye level with small green frogs. The activist mourns his murdered brothers. Lightning strobes the windows. For a roof in the rain, Los Guardacostas take bribes, mosquitoes, blood. Pigeon big bats shade open eaves before and after the earthquake. The last one I'll read is a poem that is sort of vaguely inspired by the ivory-billed woodpecker somewhere along the line, even though the ivory-billed woodpecker is not in the poem as such. It's called When That Time Comes. And if you find daylilies and under morning glories, a bird thought extinct living by its wits, or a stone balanced on a stone. You could stop breathing just like that. In the moment between the leaves, you try to lock everything as it happens. Lists, photographs, your life a ball in your fist. Someone who looks like you, kicking dust, a country road, daylilies, hands working through vines. Or did he pass into the trees without a sound? Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. Our next reader is Megan Grumbling.
Hi, everybody. Is my sound okay? Great. I'm really grateful and honored to be part of this anthology and part of this series, and I thank everyone that's made it possible and all these readers of such great variety and feeling. I am going to read a few pieces from a book called Persephone in the Late Anthropocene, which is going to be coming out this fall. And it basically launches the myth of Persephone into the age of climate change and kind of a reckoning with anthropocentrism and the question of how do we tell it? What is the role of narrative in reckoning with it? So there's a couple different voices. There's the voice of Persephone. There's the voice of a chorus that's kind of like us muddling through and other things. There are some new farmers' almanacs. So I'm just going to read a couple pieces from the beginning and the setup of the book. Chorus song, Short Shorts. At first, it was all beer gardens and orange dreamsicles. She wasn't supposed to be around now. These were her months to be away with him, eating stones and stroking clocks, or whatever she did with him. But she had chosen us. And at first, it was all holiday, all innocent debauchery, whenever she appeared out of season. Here she was in a canary yellow halter dress, opening flows of hoppy ale. Here she was in short shorts, drenching us in dandelion fizz, or with huge buttercups, grazing our chins with yolk gold. We made merry, made noise, made hay, made out like magpies. Then she was gone again. She left us each time with our suddenly bared skin, our yellowed chins, and our chosenness, with our school child sensation of having gotten away with something slight but delicious. The new Farmer's Almanac migration forecast. Larks, starlings, and swallows south of the Maritimes are expected to again winter in place. In some songbirds, desynchronized migratory restlessness disorders may result in heightened risk to livestock, jet ports, and plate glass. The new Farmer's Almanac word of the day: an exaltation is a flock of larks. Persephone's lark song. I go for the light, a love of heights and thaw, sweets out of season, day-long trilling, trilly and prip, a whole flock's skyward veer and the white of underwing. Living in the dark takes will, irony, a strong stomach for dearth, dried fruit. And no harm, time to time, to sing too much in the sun, exotic plums, fresh blistered lemon on the lips. These flights are just a lark, a least creature's thirst quenched. I do descend in time. Once I've soared, trilling out of sight, I'll fold back wings and fall like a stone. Chorus song, thirsting so hard. Schlitz all morning, sangria all afternoon. It was too hot to work, or else too cold, so we drank with her. The most homage we could muster anymore. It was too hot for lust, let alone for love, or else too cold. And what a weird mood she set, wetting us down with halved lemons, rubbing our faces with her 10 fingers, each sunk into an olive. There were more lemons, more olives than anyone knew what to do with. And then, just as suddenly, none, and only brackish water to drink. We were eating so much tapenade, drinking so many shandies, then thirsting so hard that we began to feel queasily cured from within. The new Farmer's Almanac, science tricks for children. Fill a glass with water up to the brim. Now add more water, drop by drop. Can you make the water curve higher than the brim? Chorus song, her lover. She had taken a lover here, one of us. That was the latest. She couldn't stay away, couldn't say no, peeled him grapes, carved them into rosebuds and tiny, big-bosomed nymphs, floated them in bowls of pennyroyal, egg white, and rye, indulged his slightest whim, peach, sweet strawberries, apples crossed with conquered grapes, contorted limbs and throat to fit his kiss. This lover was a reckless inebriate, it was said, a narcissist, partial to unnatural rituals. One of us, it was said. We were stricken at the thought, but stirred, jealous, and thus ravenous. And one more, lest I leave in the middle of the conflict-laden beginning. This comes from the end, once the chorus and everyone else has gone to some dark places, but found some ways back. It's called Light Song. Risen, raised once more from a worse dark than winter or wrong, I wake once more to light. Such strong solace, light after no light, yellow gold in youngest leaves, sunlight on skin, on lips. Strong solace for the loss of sweet and blameless things, of reckless love, the boundless want that barely slowed to breathe. By this light I revive a vow, a love, an eros of relent to clocks and stones, to the swell of winter, river, sea. In the light, sometimes I am learning sorrow and joy as the same breath rising in the chest, in the throat. In time, I will again descend, I will go blue, but I will not lay down my love, such love even of scythes, as strong as song, as light floods, mint leaf and lemon, wet eyes and the white of underwing. Even when the only light is the word light, is the light we have carefully kept in our cup. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. The next reader will be Mark Scroggins.
Hey, thank you, Mary, Bernard, Sarah, for all the work you've put into this. And hi, Linda, thank you. And hi, Cole, thank you for inviting me to take part. My internet connection may be a little unstable since we seem to have a thunderstorm moving in, but for the last 5 years, I have been working on a long serial project under the title Zion Off-Ramp. And I'll just read a recent section. This is number 67. So 67. That thing you forgot to do last year has turned out to be important. The little noise under the hood, that irritated you so much at first until you got to where you ignored it, has turned out to be a symptom of something big, expensive. That mole on your back, catch in your throat, a bill you accidentally threw away, bank statement you misplaced. I found your phone number, I'm embarrassed to say, stuck as a bookmark between pages 42 and 43 of a book I gave up reading 4 years ago. I'm texting you now. There's a clown show on TV every afternoon, a remote read-through of 'Tis Pity She's a Whore. All my friends are sharing pictures of their children, their meals. Someone says invisible rays are stoking the plague. Someone else tells me the windmills are feeding my tumors. In the grocery, the separation between organic and GMO is as rigidly enforced as that between kosher and trafe, and with as much logic. If I had a clear and distinct idea of where I was going, I'd know what to do next. Maybe listen to a record, pour a glass of some exotic but cheap liqueur, light a fat spliff. The first one, the tragedy, rolled over Nick's feet that warm evening last spring, fell between the boards into the water below. The second hit me hard, knocked me off my feet like I hadn't been knocked before. We're all older than we've ever been, right cliche. Younger also than we'll be tomorrow morning. Our Savior, Scripture says, went 40 days without food or society and afterwards was hungry. Fast, then temptation, citing Scripture to the accuser's face, temple, pinnacle, kingdoms of earth, sons of pride to be compared, state of war, exemption, nasty, brutish, a scramble among crumbs, Abraham's bosom, Lazarus in glory, Dives, proper name or class designator, formations of production, determining consciousness, shepherds, oxen in party-colored kine, huddled in apartments, tenanted, overborne, Edgeworth and outwearied for Jesus' sweet sake, implore thee, open the tomb, stratum by stratum, and dating our discontent by the styles of potsherds, autumn gold, avocado of childhood, toothpaste cars of pre-millennial angst, diggings flocked, embroidered and hemmed with Mallarmé's polished lacework, gracefully turned, fleeced fawn's thighs, stooped for the golden apples, to ignore the ravening board, bright red flesh, sexually differentiated by skin tone, though streaming identical coiffures signal idomeneus or just archer, and these our bones ought be found in the fourth stratum, just below the second great burning that melted all the glass and circuit boards into polished dribbles of color, veining the soil, red clay and yellow sedimentary rocks hauled out in paper bag after bag, each successive one minding me of the dead cat I dug up with my friends at 8 or 9, the squirrel I tipped with the shovel end into a new hole behind the garage, by 5 minutes missed the funeral, and in the fourth stratum, where the living walked in concentric circles, dancing floor of a grand Troy town saloon, the soft green leathers of Oz and the Castro, gypsum blocks softened by rain, shattered frescoes rebuild themselves into blueprints, 3 strata down for concrete and rebar pillars astonishingly anticipate Art Deco Miami Beach. Under the sun, the bruising rain set to competition diggers, both Turk and Hellene, self-same taskmaster, horned English pharaoh, hawk's profile, but fronted coal-rimmed eye, drop of water, great fixed gulf, stratum and stratum, means of production, earth groans beneath history, weight of misery, heavens opening just another technicolor vista. The first rainbow was miraculous only because their diggings find stratum under stratum until shovel tips scrape boneless rock, soft, dull fur of the wee thing, paws clasped as if in petition, ground under our souls, a compost of dying petitioners, cards, papers, and soft tissue melting into yellow sediment. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Our next and last reader is Jane Hirschfield, and I hope you'll all stay after Jane's reading for a discussion and share your impressions.
I am very grateful to join this community assembled on behalf of the biosphere. I'm speaking from the hem of Mount Tamalpais, whose elders include the Miwok people, the coastal redwoods, and Alan Watts. All the poems that are in the anthology are also in a new book of poems, Ledger, which was published March 10th, which in the US was pretty much the day that the world changed for most of us. And I will start with this one. As if hearing heavy furniture moved on the floor above us. As things grow rarer, they enter the ranges of counting. Remain this many Siberian tigers, that many African elephants, 300 red-legged egrets. We scrape from the world its tilt and meander of wonder, as if eating the last burned onions and carrots from a cast iron pan. Closing eyes to taste better the char of ordinary sweetness. This next poem covers a fair bit of ground. It has the International Space Station in its title. It refers to evolution, the geomorphology of Florida, terrorism, the civil war in Syria, and the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean, which seems just never to end. Day beginning with seeing the International Space Station and a full moon over the Gulf of Mexico and all its invisible fishes. None of this had to happen. Not Florida, not the ibis's beak, not water. Not the horseshoe crab's empty body, and not the living starfish. Evolution might have turned left at the corner and gone down another street entirely. the asteroid might have missed. The seams of limestone need not have been susceptible to sand and mangroves. The radio might have found a different music. The hips of one man and the hips of another might have stood beside each other on a bus in Aleppo and recognized themselves as long-lost brothers. The key could have broken off in the lock, and the nail can refused its lid. I might have been the fish the brown pelican swallowed. You might have been the way the moon kept not setting long after we thought it would, long after the sun was catching inside the low wave curls coming in at a certain angle. The light might not have been eaten again by its moving. If the unbearable were not weightless, we might yet buckle under the grief of what hasn't changed yet. Across the world, a man pulls a woman from the water from which the leapt from overfilled boat has entirely vanished. From the water pulls one child, another. Both are living, and both will continue to live. This did not have to happen. No part of this had to happen. Cataclysm. It begins subtly. The maple withdraws an inch from the birch tree. The porcupine wants nothing to do with the skink. Fish unschool, sheep unflock to separately graze. Clouds meanwhile declare to the sky they have nothing to do with the sky, which is not visible as they are, nor knows the trick of turning into infant tumbling pterodactyls. The turtles in moonlight, their long arrangement is over. As for the humans, let us not speak of the humans. Let us speak of their language. The first person singular condemns the second person plural for betrayals neither has words left to name. The fed consider the hungry and stay silent. No wind, no rain. No wind, no rain. The tree just fell, as a piece of fruit does. But no, not fruit, not ripe, not fell. It broke, it shattered. One cone's addition of resinous self-sap, one small-bodied bird arriving to tap for a beetle. It shattered. What word, what act was it we thought did not matter? And I will finish with a poem which is not in the anthology. It's the opening poem from the book. It was written in 2014 with the crisis of the biosphere in mind. It was published on January 20th, 2017, the day of the inauguration. Let them not say. Let them not say we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, as they must say something, a kerosene beauty. It burned. Let them say we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane Hirschfield. And This is a good time. We could all unmute ourselves and participate in general conversation.
Yes, everybody is, the chat room is open. Feel free to share in that way. And feel free to it's always hard with so many people, but feel free to just speak up and we'll go from one thing to the next. So thank you to all the readings. Such a variety and just so beautiful, so strong.
Well, there's so much that could be said about the readings today. I was sort of surprisingly struck with the word hunger appearing many times, and I just wanted to note that in different contexts. This is sort of a biological link. It's also an affective link of how we are creatures among other creatures. Anyway, many other things. How do we measure loss? You know, we can talk about inches or feet or whatever, but there's also the affective side. What does it mean for us? The qualitative side. Savoring what remains of the world that we know, not very well, but somewhat, the world that we love, maybe. And the whole question of accountability. You know, how we, as share in what is going on, and we kind of can't avoid claiming that. Anyway, those are just some little.
I was struck too, Mary, by the notion of accountability and at times even counting. For instance, Jane's first poem that includes counting and other mentions that it seemed to be a theme that came up this week a lot was extinction, near extinction, threat to other species, and an interesting focus on fact. And so those are two very different things, though they sometimes came together today. And I just wondered if we could hear from any of the readers about their take on accountability, counting, and factual information, how fact works into poem, and then also this issue of the threat of extinction.
I have been drawn to the inclusion of facts in poems for some years now. I think since before the question of fact became a question, which appalls me and shocks me and stuns me. But I think that the factual accounting of the unfathomable is a kind of mathematics, a kind of recording that poetry exists to do. We have other disciplines that can account for the fathomable. Poems account for the unfathomable. And the inclusion of facts is part of that. Poetry is not anti-factual. It is an ally of understanding the world with more breadth and depth than we are able to do with only the tools of the rational.
Yes. Well, that's just true. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, facts allow a kind of flight for the poem to take, that once you have an accrual of fact, then something else happens in the poem, and it can lead you to, I don't want to use the word kind of a revelation, but something other than the fact. The facts give birth to something deeply spiritual. I think that they can, anyway.
And I think facts themselves can be and are deeply spiritual. I certainly don't see any division there. But I'm going to go back to Jane's comment. I think that idea of poetry being the one mode that can account for, can factually trace the unfathomable is just a really great insight.
I think it's interesting how much we long for the inclusion of a sense of awe and wonder into our comprehension of the actuality of the world, which is what facts are drawing us into. We want a wholeness of being. And wholeness does not say this is spiritual, this is not spiritual. Every working research scientist that I know has an enormous sense of awe and an enormous sense of mystery. These are not separate endeavors.
That's for sure.
And I think it's also really important to think of alternate ways of knowing and understanding, indigenous approaches and looking for many different viewpoints, because facts, I'm a great respecter of science, but facts can be depicted in many different ways, producing many different stories. And so I think it's really, trying to see from the perspective of animals, as some of you have done in your poetry and so on, I think is one way to try to broaden our ways of knowing.
And you mentioned story. Also, one thing that struck me today was Megan Grumbling's question about the role of narrative. And so many perspectives on poetics see the narrative as playing a different role, not having a role. And so how is the role of narrative changed by poetics, by the act of poetry?
I think Megan showed that with her poem using Persephone as a season. The season is a fact. Persephone is a fact. She's a stranger, and the way Megan put her in there as a visitor and someone you sat down and had a drink with, that's the scientific or poetic. That's the observation you do with the fact. So the narrative and the observation, the taking notes seems to me, and I think it does to Jane too, seems to work as one. This communication with this thing that is the what is, the fact is what is, this strange nature that sort of shows up. You got some information on it, but not all of it. So you sit down and have a drink with it.
That's great.
Megan did it, I think that's I enjoyed that very much.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing intimacy into the conversation, because that's an important part of it also. What can we sit down and have a drink with? And maybe we poets want to be able to have a drink with all of it. The grief of it, the joy of it, the alien and the intimate and the familiar. I just love that you said that. Thank you.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah.
Do we choose what we sit down to drink with? I'm kind of playing off a question in the chat, I guess from Catherine Carter. Megan, what drew you specifically to Persephone stories, right? Do we get to choose to what extent? But there's a question for you, for Megan. What drew you specifically to the Persephone stories?
It's a story that I've known since I was a little girl, and as things have progressed in the biosphere and my understanding of our role and all that, I thought about how does the myth change for me? How would I retell the myth? How would she retell the myth? And I mean, I guess I see narrative as like our interface with the facts, right? And there are so many different narratives, and some of them we've been operating under for a really long time, and not so well, not so effectively for the biosphere. So what are the narratives that can help us and can heal us and can bring us closer to the other beings that are around us, rather than continue to perpetuate our own unique human flaws?
That brings me back to the observation of how many of the readings today touch on, in particular, threats to other species. And I thought the threat of, the half polar bear, half grizzly, where an ecological event actually created a kind of migration that in turn resulted in this hybridity that was endangered by its very nature. And that made me think about hybridities in general. Put that out there in case that.
Thanks, Cole. I'll just say something about fact. I just noticed, thinking about this, that the poems that I read and the new sequence that I'm working on, the Siberian Spring, it does all start from research as sort of the factual elements. The bears, I kind of think of them as climate migrants, and it reminded me when Catherine Carter read last week the poem about bees, and had intuitively gone to the same idea as I did, the idea of the wanderer in alliterative verse. I guess we use our facts and then find the right way into them. In terms of the facts being a way to express the unfathomable, which I love that idea. What's happening, obviously with global warming and or climate change and global heating, it's the Arctic, for in the Gothic, say, was always this sublime space of the unknown. It was a frosty hell. It was fearful because it was all covered up with snow. Now what's becoming frightening is the fact that things are being exposed, as in one of Jane's poems near the end, it's we can't say we didn't see or we didn't hear. If we don't see now, it's being revealed to us. So
there's a really interesting thing, I think, in both of those Arctic, the Growler bear and the Arctic poems, and that the facts are playing a narrative both forward and backwards. That is, the Growler bear is going back in its own history, right, back to when they split in the first place, right? And the same thing is true of things coming up from the surface, the mammoths coming up from the surface, going back to essentially where they were thousands of years ago, in a way, but not exactly, too. Yeah.
Yeah, good point. Is it the return of the repressed, or as they say in Gothic studies? But yeah, for sure.
It's just a wonderful observation, and it I think helps us feel ourselves at a certain point on a temporal continuum, and this sudden weird opportunity to see so far in the background, and will that help us to responsibly imagine the future in a way that demands our response, and seeing extinct species resurface seems to be such a visceral reminder of what we are causing and could choose not to cause. So I think that backward timeline can be really, really useful.
Yeah, and also the sense. What? So I'm also the sense.
I was just going to say, I thought that
This is so hard, the hesitations, but I just want to say, I think there's something about alternative roots of both evolution and of history. I think, Jane, maybe one of your early poems you read was doing that. You can envision and imagine the alternative roots of evolution. We see them in front of us in terms of that's what present natural history is. But of course, history and human history also has all those alternative roots. And maybe we're like on the cusp of those. And there's something also to me empowering about that, about our ability to imagine possibility. And it's a big responsibility. But I appreciated that in that poem. And it's bringing in kind of the biological tropes of temporality as well. That was very powerful to me.
Thank you very much for that. And yeah, my response to the broached idea was very much along the same lines, which is we are part of evolution. And we too will someday, this particular shape of this particular primate that we are, if life is allowed to continue, if we ourselves in our more delusional expressions and our huge power at this particular moment over the future of the biosphere, if we do not destroy it, however long from now it might be, perhaps an evolution into a kinder manifestation of ourselves is as possible. The unburied relics of the Arctic, that photograph was so powerful. And we mustn't think ourselves separate from that. We're part of that. If we do not halt it, that is the terror of this moment, is our power to not wipe out everything, because I think there are a lot of resilient species, like cockroaches are pretty resilient, rats are pretty resilient. We ourselves are a fairly resilient species biologically. We can adapt to a lot of different ecosystems. But the scariest line that I wrote that went into this new book was a line that I don't think is actually possible, but the idea of it still terrifies me, which is the idea, the line is, death saying, I too am orphan, that we could eliminate life itself. And I think it behooves us to be afraid, and it behooves us to be hopeful, because we need both of those things in order to keep the rudder of our own extraordinary ability to act as a species on our own future and the future of all other species in some kind of relationship to reality. I'm sorry, that's a rather grand statement.
I'd like to pick up on that word "if" that you used, Jane, and just sort of bring in a plea for the counterfactual, or just in a time when there is so much power being granted to the counterfactual, and when the facts, such as they are so massive. The philosopher Timothy Morton refers to them as hyperobjects, the fact of climate change, say, and it's a fact that's a construction. It's that we're constructing collectively as we move forward, and there's a lot of resistance to it. So there are counterfactuals coming into the picture. We see it now with the virus. Its data, its numbers, and they can be massaged or suppressed and manipulated to give a picture of the facts. So I was thinking of Mark's piece and sort of those details, like that mole on your back or the misplaced bill, something that didn't seem like an important fact at the time somehow becomes enormous, gains enormous import and significance. So I was just wondering about how poetry works the factual, both as something that's in time, that's constructed, that's perhaps collective, and maybe even that's a place for the counterfactual work as well, that on behalf of facts perhaps, but just kind of tweaking that sense of the spiritual, which I wholeheartedly endorse, but at the same time, there's a way in which the fact is, it's never pure in that way, I feel, especially nowadays.
Can I ask you, when you say counterfactual, are you also including, the great positive expansion of reality, which is the imagination? I can't quite tell if that's what you're saying. Yeah,
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I was thinking that, there's a sense in which climate change is a fact, that is to say inevitable, that is to say we're doomed. Whereas it seems to me that the work of the imagination is to unearth possible other futures, which also includes other pasts. That's perhaps the counterfactual. What didn't happen according to one narrative, may have, for example, the Anthropocene, climate change. Many of us address it as something futural, whereas for many beings on the planet, it has already happened. I mean, it happened for indigenous people centuries ago, really.
Yes. Yeah. I was wading in climate change in 2016. I was working those poems with Florida imagery in them. I was working on Rauschenberg's former estate on Captiva Island in Florida, and it was the rainiest January, February in Florida history. And we were wading between our workspaces and where we went to eat. And I just sort of looked around me and said, it's not the future. And I think that's a really important realization, that it's not the future. It's now. We're in it. We're calf deep in it.
And also, thank you, Jonathan, for pointing out that though in Occidental society, it's been a conversation we've been having seriously for 30 or 40 years, but for many other situations, it's been going on, as you say, for centuries. And both the radical environmental damage that has been inflicted and the preference, the anthropocentric, and not to mention so I think that to realize, and again, that how much that timeline goes as importantly backward as it does forward. It's really helpful.
Well, I'd like to add on to what Jonathan said. I'm sensing a little bit of a binary between the factual and the counterfactual. And I agree with Jonathan about the emphasis on imagination, which is probably how I would characterize my work, at least most of my work. But at the same time, I mean, words are facts. In a sense, and there can be a lot of factual things in an imaginative literary work like a poem, and there can be non-factual things too. So I mean, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's like you can bring them both together. I don't want to say you have to, but you certainly can bring them together. It's not a binary in that sense.
And facts are words too.
Yes. Well, that's true too.
And words are.
Oh, sorry, Cole. I'll just quickly jump on something that you mentioned earlier about the idea of how do you quantify, or how do these poems quantify things, and different types of facts. And Sarah's poem about the dead whale, you have an image there about the weight of the whale it's sort of on these scales of like sadness, like the weight of the whale is the way that this sadness is quantified. Anyways, I thought that was just fabulous, and throwing it in there as sort of a different type of fact, measured against a measurable fact of the weight, or of a fact that we know how to measure. So.
Thanks so much, Catherine. That's what I was trying to say when we first started talking about facts. It was describing the whale that sort of led to that other kind of fact, the spiritual fact of human sadness. It was the accrual of those facts that led to that, That's what I was trying to say in terms of facts building some sort of insight or something that jumps away from the fact and gets bigger. In this case, it's human sadness, you know? I don't know if that makes sense.
Can I say it doesn't jump away from the fact. When we say imagination, it's almost as though we're saying that imagination is something other, but imagination is an evolutionary, imagination is a part of us. Imagination is like a city is our beehive. It is, a city is natural. Imagination is natural. So when you say imagination, don't think of imagination as taking away from. I think you're right. I think imagination is part of. It is. You're right. I think it's part of. At least I think so. I agree with you.
Can we look at imagination as perhaps evolving from hard facts that allows the imagination to evolve in a way perhaps you didn't expect, rather than jumping away? Rather an evolution in some way?
Yeah. I think that the imagination, that thing that he brought up about sort of broaching evolution, how humans can add to evolution. Imagination is the way to do it. Imagination is how to add to evolution. And I think that's just part of us. That's just what we do. What humans do is just, like other species, just take the matter that's around them and change it into something that grows something else. One of the things that I think humans do is they take the facts around them and they build these funny things, you know, cities, airplanes, you know. I mean, you just take these. Your imagination just takes the real natural thing. You see a bird, you want to fly, you figure out how, and you're imagining, oh, that's how we do it. And we do it. You know, we fuck up the atmosphere, but that's how we do it. You know?
So important.
I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that point of view, because I do think this conversation's gotten too dichotomous. I agree. I think the imagination, I think language is a tool that the human species has to test and adapt to our environment. Mm-hmm. It's part of our mammalian repertoire. It's not an other. It's not, I mean, I have my own spiritual vocabulary, but I think it's embedded in fact in the world. It's part of how humans find a way of being, and hopefully, you know, spiritual sanity is connected to ecological sanity and our species adaptation, that it's all a single way of a species being. So I love that point of view.
Like, you know, I like what you just said, like language and imagination. So a porpoise learns, you know, something extra to eat and teaches it to its kid. Language, you know, so language is a way to share imagination. You know, it's no big thing. It's just the way we share shit. You know?
If we take,
that's perfect.
You know, if we divorce our imagination from fact, we betray fact as well. In the sense that if
it's true,
you know, if you hear people say something like, well, you know, it's not a big deal because there was as much carbon in the atmosphere back in the Pennsylvanian period or something. But if you can't place yourself, and then you can just walk away, oh, that's good, you know, but if you can't place yourself within that fact and realize, well, what would it be like to, you know, I mean, here I am walking around with the salamanders, and, you know, it gives you a sense that that fact is alive, right? And is not just this number or this thing, you know, over here. Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to bring up something that, Ed, I thought was really important that you brought up about nature, and that a city is natural. Imagination is natural. It's natural to see a bird and figure out a way to do the same thing. And so this idea that there's nature and non-nature, I think, is a false dichotomy, but also the idea that we change nature all the time. So we can change human nature to change in negative ways. I think if we think of it in those terms, that everything, a skyscraper is perfectly natural, it gives us a different angle on how we might stop doing that kind of thing, that we can change nature and we can change that nature too.
Even some of the things that we think of as achievements, we might discover we achieved too far and how to turn it back to where it's actually, in fact, useful. We figure humans might have figured out a way to fly as a useful thing, but maybe we'll figure out a way to fly that doesn't do so much damage. Skyscrapers are a great idea for piling people up, but maybe too many people, you see, and then we scale stuff down. So humans have always sort of adjusted their achievements. That's the imagination. What he said about going backwards and looking at the thing that was in the past is still alive. Well, you know, the idea of the skyscraper is still alive. We might want to tone those things down because the upper floors create these terrible vacuums on the bottom. You know, I mean, so we're adjusting the more we discover, you know, our imagination keeps adjusting our own discoveries, adjusting ourselves as well.
I guess one of the facts is the failure to adjust that we're dealing at the moment. I mean, that the skyscrapers keep getting built. So, I mean, when I invoked the counterfactual, I was sort of thinking of like naked Athena. You all know perhaps what I'm talking about. The woman who's thrown out in front of the riot cops, you know, completely naked in front of these armored, you know, warriors of the state. So that there is a polarizing power in force that is pursuing the false dichotomy and you pushing it and using it to destroy at ever greater rates, you know, of destruction. So I guess, you know, my question is, you know, there's a place for poetry in reminding us what the imagination is, reminding us of the imagination and of its place in the natural world. And there's also that present polarity, you know, and where do you sit as writers? Where do you feel your work? I'm asking the readers today, where do you feel your work sort of sits in relation to that? Do you feel that it's being heard, or that it's I don't want to ask that boring question, you know, is poetry making a difference? Are you doing something with it? But how do I guess it's more like, how do you incorporate that intense polarity? How is your poetry registering it and sensing it? How do you deal with it, you know, without sticking your head in the sand or going for a walk in the woods and, you know, just sort of, inshallah, everything will be okay.
Well, I'd like to bring in, if I might, another quadrant of the vocabulary of what we're talking about, which I think kind of answers the question for me a little bit that you're asking, which is we've been speaking a bit abstractly, I love all of these points, but what I haven't heard is the vocabulary of emotion. And I think that along with the inclusion of facts and imagination and possibility and the increase of reality that poems and language, which is given liberty to play in unusual ways, brings us, another of the jobs that poetry does for the world, whether it's listening or not, you know, that, as you say, is a separate question. But we cannot understand what things mean without including in that our own feelings about these experiences that we are having of the contemporary world. And I think what poems bring into that conversation and offer to that conversation, and why in crises people so often do turn to a poem, however momentarily, but crisis is when people need poems. And it's because poems throw open the gate of feeling. And it is by this gate of emotion and feeling that we are able to weigh what we think about things. We can't judge what matters to us, what doesn't matter to us, what seems a movement towards the better and what seems a movement toward the worse, without the speech of the heart, the belly, the anxiety that changes the electrical impulses on our skin. We are physical beings, and this physiology of feeling is what poems help bring into the language with which we talk about our current situations. And it's very undividing. It's the opposite of polarization or dichotomy or binary response to things.
Yeah, it's that thing where people say mm-hmm or amen, no words, just I feel it too. Saying that is even too much. But what you get when that happens, that mm-hmm, is that you get, they work together. Those two people work together. And that's a new creation. That's not one person. That's a new creation of a new society. Even though it's only two, it's a new society. And that's a move, you see. And I think that's what you're talking about, Jane, that you have the, you can't agree on the next step if you don't have the other person. So this question about how do we feel, you don't feel. You just listen for the amens. And that's your partner. And then you all put the stone suit together and you go on.
Yeah.
And whether you're the group that survives or not, that's not important, but you lived. And what we do is we live by those emotions.
Yeah.
And we make a language for that. We make objects for that.
Yeah.
That's how it goes on.
Yeah.
I think you're right, Jane. I think that's right.
Right, and poetry can also help us feel with, not just each other in society, but feel with all the other, people that are creatures. And I think part of what the emotion and the imagination can do through poetry is to help us reconceive what we mean when we say we, right? So we as this society, as the entire human society on the globe, as all of the living creatures, as the mycelium under the earth, right? Like, who is we? And then when we go to rethink our skyscraper and maybe dial it back or whatever, we think about it in terms of how does it affect us? And that's a different us than maybe we've been thinking about it for the last few millennia.
That large us is Persephone. I didn't know Persephone, but we know her feeling through you. I made the joke about someone you sit down and have a drink from your poem, but that idea of being able to sit with former people's feelings is what you're talking about and is what Jane is talking about. And that's what moves forward. We don't know who she was. We're not even sure who we were, and we know we're going to die. But we know that the idea of whatever it was that we passed, however we passed it, between each other, we know that lives.
Is that the movement from the fact to the act? I'm very happy to hear this conversation, because to me that sort of the act, that really was the revolution in poetics at mid-century when Charles Olson, wrote his projected verse manifesto, and the poets of the Black Mountain School sort of bringing poetry from this sort of inert Grecian vase state to an act, an act of projective and ultimately something relational. I was very glad to hear Mark read his elegy for Jack Collum, a poet who was always taking poetry out of the library and the poetry reading and the bookstore and the gallery into public space. He would write poems on Pearl Street in Boulder, and you could walk by and drop a quarter in his hat and he'd write you a poem. He taught poetry in schools for decades, and for me, that modeling of not only the fact of but the act of the poem. What do we do with poems? Where do we take them? It's just I think that's a crucial part of ecopoetics, as I understand it.
I wanted to get back to the original question that Jonathan posed, and you'd mentioned the and I don't think this is a term you used, but what I will term the sort of denialism that we're seeing among the right wing for facts and for science, and which of course is all tied up in a sense of ideology. But I think one thing as a poet that I see as sort of a responsibility, not that I claim to do this better or worse than anyone else, but that I would see as a responsibility is to sort of maybe not circumvent that, but to sort of create a language out of which that resists that in some way, that asserts the factuality of facts. And I'm being very vague here. I wish I were being a little more specific here, but I just wanted to throw that out. In that sense, I would view poetry as resistance to the many dark forces in our society at the moment.
Well, there are certainly times when science itself gets away from its facts and it constructs a narrative. I'm thinking of race particularly and things like that, where there was a lot of science that said, working with the ideas that were its generator, basically, interpreting the facts that way. So in a sense, facts are nothing without being conditioned by the way one interprets them and the way even one selects them, right?
So in other words, a narrative.
Yeah.
And that's getting back to I think Cole started this conversation by pointing to narrative in some people's work, and so in a sense we need a narrative to make sense of the facts.
Right.
Critic Margaret Ronda, who was actually a student
alternative.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying Margaret Ronda, who was
I think I'm the one with the slow Broadman. Jonathan.
I was just saying
Jonathan,
that. Go. Yeah, okay, I'll go, and then you go. Margaret Ronda, a student of Jack Collum's, she writes of realism, kind of new realism. Her term is realism, which is interesting because it's not as dualistic as Jack.
I just wanted to say I don't think the choice is limited to narrative or lyric, and I want to give a shout out to the whole lineage of documentary poetry, in which I think poets and to Muriel Rukeyser and using facts and social texture and social context to really unite fact, science, and society and feeling. And I think that's something that poets maybe can uniquely do. And it gives you a range from the narrative to the totally non-narrative in terms of aesthetics. And I think there's a lot of wonderful work along those lines.
And precisely the fusing of these modes creates a kind of tension that allows each mode, the lyric or the narrative, which is a kind of dichotomous way of looking at it, but these different modes then, by knocking up against each other, can actually exceed themselves, which doesn't get done except in poetry.
That's true.
When I think about ecopoetics, I'm a war literature scholar, and I borrow a lot in my own practice from writers like Tim O'Brien, who clearly, he's a narrative writer, and he talks in that famous story, How to Tell a True War Story. He talks about what he calls the happening truth. The happening truth is just the facts, ma'am, but he wants to marry that up with the stomach truth, and that's when we get the real fusion and the power this hybrid narrative lyric creation.
Well, Evelyn mentioned documentary poetry, and Jane mentioned emotion in poetry. And the thing that comes to my mind in terms of emotion in poetry, one example is Charles Reznikoff's work. I mean, where he will just have these poems that give very bland, factual details about things like the Holocaust, and it's more powerful than anything practically I can think of in terms of evoking that kind of emotion in one. It's some of those poems are quite devastating, in fact.
I think that's probably, again, the reframing of a fact by putting it in a poem is what allows us amplitude to take in our response to it. It's not that we can't respond to facts when we meet them in the newspaper. 2 billion birds disappeared from the planet. That was an absolute, blow to the diaphragm. It stopped me from breathing, even in a newspaper headline. But so often people can get numb to the meaning of numbers and facts and the recitation of catastrophe. And it's poetry's job to put it in a room where we all understand our job is to respond as full human beings. I never worry too much about genre distinctions. I don't, I don't think, is Ledger a more documentary poetry book than a book I wrote 5 years ago or 15 years ago? And sure, it probably is, not least because of the great gift of the lineage of documentary poetry as keeps being brought forward, by C.D. Wright and going back to Reznikoff and forward to Wright and, back in a way to Christopher Smart, back in a way to Lucretius. Science used to be written in the form of verse. It was written as poems originally because poetry was what made things memorable and easy to hang on to precisely, which is what we want to do. I have this very trite thought, and I'm going to go ahead and say it, which is I have been haunted for a while now by the line from Hamilton, who gets to tell the story? And I think that too is part of poetry's job. I loved the comment earlier about deciding who we mean when we say we, because that is a thought that I have carried since I was 17 years old. What do I want to mean when I say we? And I want it to mean all of it, all existence, all, human, beyond human, right down to the rocks. And part of our job as poets is to voice the voiceless and to speak for what can't use English without a little help, or French, or German, or Japanese, or any of the many, many, many vanishing indigenous languages that we're losing. What is it? 7 every 14 days? 1 every 14 days, I guess. So who gets to tell the story? What story are we choosing to tell? And with what intentions are we bringing it forward? Because I don't think poetry is necessarily, if you define poetry in its broadest sense, not narrowing it down to what we hope it might mean, but just, how has it been used in human history? It has not always been beneficent. There are war poems. There are poems in support of institutions we find appalling. Poetry is a neutral technology, but we, this generation, speaking in this conversation, every poem that I heard in the reading today had intentions towards a larger awareness, an appropriate grief, a noticing of what we do not want to allow to pass unnoticed.
in talking about these other languages, I particularly appreciated, Megan, in your work, the sound of the bird's language. And we often try and voice for that which cannot speak, and we're forced to use English or Spanish or whatever, Finnish, whatever is our language. But the fact that you brought the bird's vocabulary into the work, I particularly appreciated that. It's really great. I'm noticing Time's Winged Chariot, and as host, I have to get on to something else. But thank you. And I also just want to thank everybody for plowing through with this difficult new medium we've got. I've been so impressed by the generous way that everyone handles discussion and has really made it work. And it's everybody's instant collaboration that makes that work. So come join
you, Paul. Thank you for border collieing us. Thank you for an amazing conversation.
Next week we've got Linda Russo introducing, Mene Bersenbrugge, Adam Dickinson, David Greenspan, Mary Beth Holloman, Lynn Keller, Marta Lopez Loachis, and Chris Pedler. So please come join us at the same time, same address, share with friends, and hope to see you then. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.